in this celebration of Linda Freeman. I have to say that my first interaction with Linda was in a colloquium that I organized back in 2012 at Wits University. So I've just moved from Wits University in Johannesburg to UCL. And we were able to get Linda to come to the colloquium on Canada-South Africa relations. And we had a great few days. I recognize a few faces here, actually, from the colloquium. And so it's wonderful to be able to come and celebrate Linda's career, and in particular talk about a really important topic, namely sort of Canadian quasi-governmental roles in ending of apartheid. This panel, I think, as Nduka quite rightly mentioned, is a heavy-hitting panel. We have a fantastic group of people here who have a range of experiences in terms of how they engaged or were involved with the Canadian government and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. We'll start with Keith Bezanson here, who many of you will know as a former president of IDRC, but he is also a former diplomat, having been an ambassador in Peru and Bolivia. And Keith was president of IDRC during sort of the key moment of transition into the democratic dispensation in South Africa between 1991 and 1997, and I think we'll reflect on his experiences there. We have Walter McLean, who is a long-standing Canadian politician, having held cabinet posts, as well as him being a Presbyterian minister. He was also the MP for Waterloo for close to I guess it was 12 years or 13 years. 15 years, there you go. Math is a qualitative skill, everybody, I'm not a quantitative one. And then finally we have John Schramm, who it's probably easier to introduce John Schramm as of what he was not ambassador of on the African coast. He was ambassador to Ethiopia, Sudan, Angola, Zimbabwe. He was High Commissioner to Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Botswana. And it's also nice to be able to take this moment to recognize John, who will be getting an honorary doctorate from the University of Guelph this Congratulations. So Nduka has given me the marching orders in a very public way. We do have a good amount of time for this panel. We're hoping that we can have a good conversation amongst ourselves, but I'm going to give our colleagues here 15 minutes each, and I'll give you sort of gentle signals as you're approaching that. We'll start with Keith, we'll move to Walter, and then we'll end with John. Keith, please take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I know the admonition is to contextualize knowledge of Linda. And Linda, we don't know one another, so I'm probably the only person in this room that can't say I have a direct experience with you. But I do have a direct experience with one of your former students, Mark Van Amerenden. Yes. And I phoned him yesterday to tell him I was doing this because he should be the one doing it. He was the anchor of what we did in South Africa over... You're not hearing me?
No. Just spell it without the entire voice of Dave.
No, okay, well I'll shout then. Okay,
Oh,
amplify. But he asked me to extend to you his very warmest greetings and best regards. Mark should be the one doing this. He knows the background, he knows the details, he is infinitely better qualified to be here than I am. But since he can't be here, I've agreed to step into the breach. And I'm relying on memory only and some notes that I made during my tenure as IDRC president. And some of what I say may not be fully accurate or reflected fully in your excellent book, which is already referred to. So people are free to correct me in the conversations that will ensue. So that's just by way of general introduction. Now look, to me, looking back, you can divide what IDRC, and that's what I'm talking about, the role of IDRC in this amazing transition that took place in Southern Africa and South Africa. You can divide it into three periods. The pre-1990, when Mandela was released, that was the antecedent to what then happened. The second stage was 1990 to 94, that most difficult and dangerous period of transition, where the outcomes were anything but certain, and where indeed there was open talk about a coup, there was open talk of civil war. It was a very dangerous period that tested everyone, including the Canadian resolve and the Canadian approach to trying to help the democratic movement in South Africa. And the third period that I'm very familiar with is the post-Mandela to 1997 when I left IDRC. And that's when my notes stop. So I know there's a period after that, but I could leave it to others to comment on that. I'll signal the conclusion, which is amply reflected in your book, Linda, The Ambiguous Champion. It is that for the period 87, and I'll stop at 97, you can fill in the blanks beyond that, Canada punched way above its weight internationally. We were, as was pointed out before, playing a major role, and we were not very self-facing about it, as was commented on by one of the speakers. In fact, we were sometimes quite boastful of it, and I think with good justification. I think we punched above our weight, and we played a very important role in the transition. And I do agree with the speaker who said we should be proud of that. I think it was a seminal moment in Canadian foreign relations, Canadian foreign policy, Canadian foreign activism. I also would say that IDRC punched way, way above its weight during that period. It was an organization that was known and highly respected internationally, but little known in Canada. And I think it was a coming of age of IDRC, and all the things that it was able to do were manifest in what we were able to do in that period in South Africa. So that's my signal. That's my conclusion. Stage one. A bit of modesty here, and not to fall into hubris. We need to know that we weren't the first. Rockefeller and Ford started working very directly with the mass democratic movement well before IDRC entered into the picture. I think 3 or 4 years, Linda, you would know this better than I do. But it worked both with the exiles and with the movement within the country. It worked mainly by trying to develop the human resources for governance over that period through scholarships and all kinds of other inputs that those two foundations are well known for. When did IDRC enter? Well, it was basically 1987. And here again, it wasn't a completely autonomous decision by IDRC. If you read the record, it was encouraged to do this by the government of the day. That was the Mulroney government with Joe Clark as foreign minister. And it was also encouraged by Foreign Affairs to take a very activist role in helping the mass democratic movement. Why was that? Because, quite rightly, Foreign Affairs did not want to see to be too closely associated with the ANC. Remember that the mass democratic movement had more than one party in it. ANC was by far the dominant party, but trade unions were involved, NGOs were involved, churches were involved. It was a mass movement. You didn't want to pick winners in advance. IDRC, being an independent entity, could play a role without having the full stamp of the Canadian government on its credentials. So that's when it started, and it went to the board, and the board approved a cautious approach. I remember reading that when I arrived at IDRC. It was not to scale up quickly. It was to do a reconnoitering study to see what might be done, and then to go forward. Well, 2 people visited to take this on. Mark was one of them, and Pierre Sané, who many of you may know, who became the head of Amnesty International, was then with IDRC as the regional director for West Africa, took that on. They spent 3 weeks, and they came back with a report, which I have reread for this meeting. And it's a very interesting report. It said there's no point in going slow, and there's no point in trying to influence at the margins. This is big. If you're going to be involved, get involved and do it right. That's what went to the board. And can you imagine the board's reaction to this? Political activism by an organization that does research. Well, this was discussed and discussed and discussed. But finally, the decision was taken, let's go for it. And so we began in 1987 with all kinds of different measures that tried to bring together. Oh, and the other thing that report said was work inside and outside, quote unquote. And the outside meant with the exiles, the ANC and others who had been exiled to all parts of the world, including Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. And inside, directly with the movement itself. And so that was taken on in 1987. And how was it done? All kinds of things were done. Oh, by the way, the other thing in that report pointed to, and Linda, I think if I remember right, having read your book about 10 years ago, that you bring this out in it, there were deep divisions within the Mass Democratic Party movement, the Mass Democratic movement. There were real conflicts, there were power struggles, and so one had to choose the entry points and the partnerships very carefully, lest unintended negative consequences result, which would be damaging to the movement itself. And that was a strong caution given when Mark and Pierre conversed with both the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. They said, be careful, okay? You can fall into multiple traps in going forward. So it was a cautious approach that was taken. It was through meetings and workshops, it was through gatherings that tried to bring the internal and external together around themes, around important themes that would potentially bear in major ways on the options for the future for South Africa. And I looked at my notes again from long ago, and some of these I picked up that I think were particularly important. There was a gathering that brought the exiles and many of the internals to a meeting in Maputo in mid-1987, which Mark also attended. In fact, I think he co-chaired it. Thabo Mbeki came to the meeting. The aim of the meeting was to discuss pathways forward and policy frameworks that would allow the movement to come from objecting to things to proposing things that could be put on the table for negotiation. It was, according to Mark's notes on this, a very difficult meeting. All the tensions between the exiles on the one side and the movement inside came out, and that there were real disputes on the floor, and there were power struggles. But according again to his notes, it ended well, that they agreed that they had to come up with a much more systemic set of policy instruments if they were to go forward, and that would require research and quasi-research, not deep research, but practical, ongoing instruments and mechanisms that would allow them to propose matters for discussion and negotiation. At the same time, there were initiatives on HIV/AIDS, there were policy studies on the urban sector, the townships were burning at the time, we know that. There were murders, assassinations were going on. It was a very difficult period. Infrastructure and finance were big on the table. There was a huge one on economic transformation, which happens to have been chaired by a person called Rafi Kaplinski, whom you will know, who was also one of my professorial fellows when I moved from IDRC to head the Institute of Development Studies in Britain. So I have his take on this as well. Also a very, very difficult journey as he described it. But this produced broad outlines of industrial strategy sector by sector. There are about 10 sector studies. They weren't deep studies, but they pointed to the ways forward and the options and the pathways. So it was a basis on which to build. Mark was declared in '87 persona non grata. So he could not go into South Africa, yet he was anchoring the South African program from here in Ottawa. I'm going on too long.
No, you're fine. You're
okay. Right, but what was clear, even though he was non grata, these earlier efforts had created a sense of, I dare say, partnership, but certainly a sense of trust that we were doing this together. It was not teams coming in from the World Bank or the IMF to say what you do and how you do it. It was working with the groups that were involved intimately in this, including their conflicts, to try to find the common ground. It was a role of a facilitator, a catalyst, far more than it was the expert coming in from outside. And I think it quite clearly was the correct approach. Well, that was the pre-period. 1990, I think it was February, Mandela was released, and that changed the political calculus in very dramatic ways. First of all, Mark was no longer persona non grata. So that created an opportunity to do something about that, which I'll come to in a minute. This was the most intense period, 1994. As I said, the country was ablaze. The rumors of what would and would not happen were there. The risk of it all dissolving into a violent conflict were great, and it required, and this is written by many people, the brilliant skills of Nelson Mandela to hold it together so that it didn't dissolve into a destructive conflict that would have destroyed the country itself. But what we'd done before created this opportunity, as soon as Nelson Mandela came in, to do something which we were asked to do. This was a request that came from the people around Mandela, including, who was the first finance minister? Trevor Manuel, yeah. Would we set up something called a MERG, a Macroeconomic Research Group, which we did. And it, 5 minutes, oh boy. Okay, it brought together an amazing group of economists from all over the world. It was headed by Jerry Heliner. Benno Ndulu was on it, the name many of you will know. And there were many others, I won't mention that. The MERG report came out. It took many months of careful analysis for it to come out. And I dare say, and this is without hubris, but it's certainly not, I hope, with false immodesty, modesty as well, it had a major influence on economic policy and thinking in South Africa. It was cited frequently by Nelson Mandela, and you will recall, John, when we met at his place in Soweto, he referred specifically to that report. So it became a guiding framework for policy going forward. The MERG report then led to multiple other studies financed by IDRC. And I won't go over, there was an Science and Technology Policy Mission. S&T in South Africa was for the military and for the suppression of the majority. It had to be changed completely, so there needed to be a whole framework of different instruments and different arrangements if that was to happen. Well, that was led by my dear, now late friend, Jeff Oldham, who was Mr. Science and Technology Policy, who was then my science advisor at IDRC, because he had just retired at that point. There were about 20 other studies I won't go into, all of which were aimed at the transition away from the apartheid system, what you needed to put in place in policy and practice and organization. And then my last 3 or 4 minutes, since you're giving me the signal, Mr. Chair. Look, in all of this, though, I want to say this clearly. IDRC received the most amazing support from the Department of Foreign Affairs, including its then Minister, Joe Clark, and we had direct access to the Office of the Prime Minister, who was very fully on side with this. That was Brian Mulroney. So there was no problem doing this. We were supported fully. CETA could not enter at that point because there was no bilateral program possible with the apartheid government. But there was a close connection and a preparing of CETA for the time when it could come in with a bilateral program. So there was a synergy that was absolutely amazing. I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime departments joined up so tightly and working together in a spirit of real harmony and real sharing this that I knew at that time. Okay, then stage 3, 94, the government comes in, but then it changed rather dramatically. We worked directly with the minister. We knew them all then because of all the work we had done. And by the way, there was something happened then too, in my judgment, that was important and unavoidable, but had unintended negative consequences. The diversity of the movement itself for democracy included NGOs, included private sector, it included the trade unions. Almost all of them came into government. So you had something homogeneous then rather than heterogeneous. And I often wondered whether we didn't lose some of that dynamic interplay between different interest groups as a result of that. That's not a conclusion. It is a hypothesis which scholars like Linda could no doubt enlighten me on, but I have no answer to it, only a question. So after the election, it was working with them on practical approaches and research, but it was really applied research. And as soon as it would come out, it would be drafted into legislation. Now, that is a position that IDRC had never been in before and carried with it grave risks that we'd get things wrong. And I remember going to the board on numerous occasions where this would be discussed and where there was a real concern that we were out of our depth and we could do, without intending to, we could have unintended negative consequences. Flora MacDonald was the chair of the board at that time, and those of you who knew Flora know how tightly committed she was to South Africa and the transition. So the conclusion was always the gavel coming down saying we're going to continue doing it. And I felt mightily supported as a result of that. Okay, then CETA came in a very big way. We were the executing agency. This was on a governance program. Al Johnson, as you know, was the anchor for it, former head of the CBC, and so it went. The office, I opened an office in South Africa in '92. Mark went there, and it became our largest program worldwide. It was larger in terms of staff than all of our other regional centers combined. I think it had 80 or 90 staff at the time, of whom 50 or 60 were expatriate or professionals. And the budget was, I tried to get it, the best I could come to from my notes were about 40 to 50 million a year. And it wasn't our money. We only had 100 million. Part of it was our money, part of it was CETA, part of it was the German aid program, part of it was US aid, part of it was private sector. We became a focal point for programs that others wanted to do, but wanted to do them through the vehicle of IDRC. And then, for reasons I do not know, in 2000 I had left and the office was closed. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. We'll go straight over to Walter McLean.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Thank you very much. Let me say it's a pleasure to be with my fellow panelists. Keith and I started our African interests in Nigeria light years ago, the early days of
You
CUSO.
still got that dust on you.
And have been in touch since, and it's been a particular pleasure to work with John through the years. Let me start by saying that my unexpected and unanticipated role on behalf of the Canadian government is quite well explained in Linda's book. I found myself in a caucus which had very little sympathy. And she outlines in great detail the situation that I was in and that the Prime Minister found himself in with his own convictions. David MacDonald had hoped to be here, and I had called him after David and Susan had called and said we were having this event. And I'm very grateful for it, because living in Mennonite country, it's a bit like quilt building. The story of Canada's involvement in all the sectors, and we've just heard the IDRC input, which is a part, it's one of those parts on the quilt. And there are many, many parts that need to be pulled together and to tell that story. So I'm grateful for those who have organized here. Very grateful for being able to pull together some of the other parts. Let me say that one of the stories that David told me some time ago, and said, you know, we should be trying to pull this together. David MacDonald was an early member of Parliament from Prince Edward Island. He was there, as he says, when he was still in diapers. And aside from distinguishing himself from voting against the War Measures Act and others, he has my admiration, since we share 3 grandchildren together, and we were seatmates in the last Parliament up till '93. But David said, after the defeat of the Clark government, he was invited by Mr. Clark to become his policy advisor. And they were looking at foreign policy issues in opposition. And as David said, shortly afterwards, they were looking at global issues that the Progressive Conservative Party in opposition might lift up. And he said, David canvassed the idea of apartheid, and the whole global racial issue is echoed there. Joe was ambivalent about that, understanding the pressures he was receiving from within the caucus that had survived the election. And he demurred as an issue that should be picked up at that point. Shortly thereafter came a letter from the president of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, one Brian Mulroney, saying, why is my party not lifting up this issue in opposition? And I mentioned that, and it was timely when David told me of that illustration, that the early commitment of Mulroney to Diefenbaker and to whether or not the stories around exactly what happened, but Diefenbaker's identification of the issue early on was a part of the driving interest maintained by Brian Mulroney from that point on. My early days at the University of Toronto, I recall the impetus of the African Student Foundation. When I was president of the student body at the University of Toronto, I found in my papers there were petitions on the issue 1959, 1960 on the apartheid issue, urging the government at that day to be more active on that. The times then, in the years of the emergence and pulling together overseas groups in CUSO, a lot of the early work was focused on Africa, partly because of the work of the African Student Foundation and others. And it was interesting for me, living in Nigeria from 62 to 67, that the signal thing, there were two signal events during those years. One was the Rwanda trial and Nelson Mandela. It not only galvanized all parts and all tribal groups within Nigeria at that point. And so in Ghana, when I was visiting there, and as I went across Africa and, to visit East Africa CUSO operations, I found that they are the same. It was a uniting purpose in Africa, which went on to be very helpful to me when I went to the UN as special rep on behalf of Africa and Commonwealth affairs. The second part, galvanized, was the assassination of John Kennedy. The U.S. has lost a president, we've lost a leader. And there was that sense of leadership. And I give that as background only to say that the rising interest during my years as a pastor at Knox Church Presbyterian in Waterloo, I was also chairman of the Commission on World Concerns of the Canadian Council of Churches. There, with Ted Scott, primate at those days, and others, this was in forefront. And of course, we began the conflict, which you see echoed in the U.S. between the so-called evangelicals of the World Council of Churches and the Committee to Combat Racism, and the mobilizing within and some division within the Canadian Christian community alone on the issues of race. Coming to Parliament, I was, after the years in opposition, I had had a number of years on the arms issue, lobbying to start Parliamentarians Global Action with Doug Roach and others, Mark McGuigan and others at the UN, and across party lines. And that became helpful later on. After we formed the government, I was invited to be Secretary of State for Canada and Minister responsible for the status of women, and led the delegation as a man to the Nairobi mid-decade conference. I was booed at the first speech. By the end, we had a standing ovation relative to Africa and the issues that women were espousing at this point, and the delegation that we had there. As Secretary of State and Minister responsible for human rights, I had the opportunity came when Desmond Tutu came to Canada. This would have been 84, 85. I said I want to receive Desmond Tutu. I was refused permission, principally by Foreign Affairs, because he was a member of the ANC and they were a terrorist group. So I have